basically my thought today was to go over a little bit about this brief, which is the first of 4, as Matthew mentioned, and also then to go over not necessarily every finding, but kind of what stuck out to me the most, or what I think we didn't get to maybe go into as much detail as possible in the memo. It might be in a footnote, and then really open it up for any questions or clarifications that you guys might have. So and let me figure out how to do this. So bear with me as I figure out as well how to move through these slides. So first and foremost, just a little bit of an overview about what this data is, because we're using a new data set that was funded and supported through the My Future NC project. And this is where we actually have 8 complete cohorts of North Carolina high school graduates. So that's 757,000 students, just a bit more than that, from the graduating classes of 2009 through 2016. And then from North Carolina Department of Public Instruction through EPIC, which is a policy research program at UNC, we also have a data set that contains, for each of those students, demographic characteristics, selected academic characteristics, which are a bit more hit or miss, and then some school characteristics, like the share of students that have free and reduced price lunch, the percentage of teachers that have advanced degrees, etc. And then from the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a nonprofit database of kind of post-secondary enrollment records, we have data that span enrollments and graduation from July 1st, 2009 through May 15th, 2018. Because people can put blocks on their records for privacy, we know that we're not getting all students here, but this is about as comprehensive as it gets at the national level. So we have over 4 million unique enrollment terms for 555,309 students. So this is the first time that we're really getting to look not just at people who enroll on time in the fall semester in a North Carolina public institution. We're actually being able to look at people who are crossing state borders, who are waiting a year, 2 years, 3 years or more to go to college, if we have enough time since their graduation to see that, and students who are going to private institutions. And then we have nearly 250,000 unique graduation records for degrees and credentials, with detail on all of those, from the institution attended, kind of the date of attendance, the date of award, and some details on the level of award. So it's a very rich data set, and we've been really excited to pull out some basic findings from it for you. So we're gonna start here with really what we're thinking about is college access. And if you're at the February commission meeting, and a lot of the stuff we talk about is really with reference to on-time enrollment, which means that students were enrolled in a post-secondary institution in the fall semester immediately following high school graduation. If any of you are working in higher education institutions, you know that there is not necessarily a universal definition of what a semester is or when it begins and ends. So we used guidance from Harvard's Strategic Education Data Project, and we measured on-time enrollment as an enrollment that did not end in a withdrawal or leave of absence, and that occurred or spanned October 1st after their high school graduation. So that's on-time enrollment. Any enrollment that occurred after that was a delayed enrollment, and there were a few instances where students were enrolled prior to that, but not on October 1st, but most of those were summer or short terms for these students. And one of the biggest findings that we've seen is that in spite of this broader conversation where we're putting increasing emphasis on the importance of post-secondary education and training to kind of high quality economic outcomes, we've seen overall enrollment rates are declining. We've seen declines in on-time enrollment rates. Some of this was that they spiked during the Great Recession and then they dropped and they increased a little bit more, but they're still 57% in 2016 versus 59% in 2009. And that's that light blue line on the bottom. And what you can see on the top line, actually, so that's saying, well, maybe they don't enroll on time, but they enroll within 2 years. And we're seeing pretty steady declines in that rate. So 2009 high school graduates, almost 70% had enrolled within 2 years. In 2016, that was down to almost 65%. And that's because what we're seeing is that delayed enrollments overall are not making up for they're not kind of counterbalancing the decline in on-time enrollments. In general, students are less likely to enroll, whether that's enrolling on time, enrolling within a year, or enrolling 2 to 4 years after the fact. So that's kind of one of these interesting stories that in this broader conversation of greater need for post-secondary, we are seeing delayed enrollment rates or declining enrollment rates. Some of this could be because we are graduating more high school students, but overall, this is a pattern I think that could use a bit more understanding. One of the things that this data set allowed us to do was actually to look at on-time enrollment rates by county and to start looking at this more geographically. So this was the average over this 8-year period across the 100 counties in the state. And those darkest blue areas are those where over 60% of students are immediately going to a post-secondary institution. And that includes everything from a less than 2-year private institution to UNC or a 4-year private or public institution out of state or in state. So this covers any sort of post-secondary enrollment, with the exception it doesn't get all of like the trade schools, like beauty schools and cosmetology schools, but it does get about 80% of those. So we're getting most on-time enrollments. And what you can see is that there are certain regions, particularly in the Sandhills region and the Southeast region here, with those black lines representing the prosperity zones, where students are just not enrolling in college at the same rate as their peers in more urban areas. So Anson County actually has the lowest average on-time enrollment rate. About 40% of high school graduates from Anson immediately go to any sort of post-secondary program, compared to Wake County, where that proportion is 66%. So these are large gaps that are just going to perpetuate some of the broader challenges that we might be seeing across the state. So there's a bit more detail on the geographic issues in the brief, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. That the one thing that I wanted to point out that I think is really important is that what we saw is that statewide, the average on-time enrollment rate was 57%. And that was actually kind of a decline that when we look at 2016 versus 2009, we saw a decline of 2 percentage points. And when we look at the racial and ethnic groups below, you see wide-ranging disparities in those groups in terms of their on-time enrollment rates, from 38% among Hispanics to 67% among Asians. But none of those groups had a more than 2 percentage point decline, which my first intuition is when no group is below average, what's going on? And this is actually a very classic thing of demographic change and composition shift. Because you'll see that our Asian and our Black students, our Asian and our Hispanic students, my apologies, are both increasing their average on-time enrollment rate. Asian students had an increase of nearly 5 percentage points, and Hispanic student average on-time enrollment rates increased by 7.6 percentage points. All of the other groups are declining, but the state is becoming increasingly Hispanic. There's a growing share of Hispanic high school graduates, and even though Hispanic on-time enrollment rates are increasing substantially, the gap between their average on-time enrollment rates and virtually all other groups means that because they're a growing share of the state's population, we're seeing overall the decline statewide is greater than that for any significant group. So this is where when we're starting to talk about why does demographic change matter, we're seeing it very clearly just over this 8-year period in shifts in on-time enrollment rates overall versus for any specific individual group. There were a few other things that really stuck out to me, and one of these were in these dot plots, which is a series of these plots for figure 5. If you do have the material, it's on page 8. And in particular, we looked at kind of gaps by sex, so between male and female students, and then by selected racial ethnic comparisons, so for Black and white and Hispanic and white students across the state and across the prosperity zones. And what really stood out here for us was that in our state's highest performing region, so North Central, which is just under North Carolina because these are alphabetically ordered, the North Central Prosperity Zone is the triangle. And the North Central has some of the best overall outcomes while also having some of the worst racial and ethnic gaps. So, and it's not necessarily because the minority groups in these areas are doing better than average. They're often doing average or slightly worse than average. And I thought that was really important to take away, because this is a bit of don't let the overall average hide what is going on with some of our subgroups, because the Black-White gap in on-time college enrollment rate in the North Central is 18 percentage points, which is 50% higher than the statewide gap of 12 percentage points. The only other place where the gap is higher than the statewide average is the Southwest Prosperity Zone, which is home to Charlotte. We do see that the Piedmont Triad actually has a more narrow gap. So this is not necessarily that metro areas just have larger gaps. We see similar story when it comes to Hispanics. In fact, North Central here again, you see that the gap is 31 percentage points between Hispanic and white students. It's pretty large in the Piedmont Triad. Again, it's 28 percentage points there. Where it is smallest is in the Northwest. So that's 19 percentage points in those regions. And I think that this is a bit of just being aware of composition in areas, and sometimes the averages are going to be masking really different experiences for different groups of students. So the next figure, actually, and if this is on the following page, on page 9, this is just showing how overall kind of delayed enrollments and on-time enrollments accumulate together to kind of either narrow or widen gaps between groups. So if you look on the far left side, that North Carolina total bar is that 28 percentage points in below is students who never enrolled. So we're looking here just at 2009 to 2013 graduates. So we have a 4-year time horizon after graduation to look at their enrollment patterns. That darkest blue bar, the kind of teal bar, is those who enrolled on time. And then above those shows you those that didn't enroll on time, but enrolled within 1 year, enrolled within 1 to 2 years, or enrolled within 2 to 4 years. And in particular here, you can see that while Black and white students, for example, had a 12 percentage point gap in on-time enrollments, Black students are more likely to enroll in after 1 year or after 2 years compared to white students, and they close the ever enrolled gap over that time period. While Hispanic students do have higher delayed enrollment rates than white students, their kind of big gap in on-time enrollment rates means that they're really not ever making significant changes in closing the overall enrollment gap. There's just a few more things that I wanted to hit on. And one of these was that for the most recent 3 years of our high school graduates, we do have ACT scores. So remember that ACT has 4 subtests, and each of those has a college readiness benchmark aligned to it. What we see is that in general, students who enroll in college and enroll on time are more likely to have hit all 4 benchmarks, 3 of those benchmarks, or 2 of those benchmarks. But we're still looking at 36% of these students who met no college readiness benchmarks. And again, 31% of those students who did not enroll on time met at least 1 college readiness benchmark. So we are seeing that some very college ready students are not enrolling on time, while many students who are enrolling are not necessarily college ready as measured by the ACT. The last major thing that I think I wanted to make sure that we hit on was when the type of institution individuals are enrolling at, when we look at the timing of enrollment. So when students are enrolling on time, so they're enrolling in that first fall semester, they're overwhelmingly going to UNC, a UNC system school, a North Carolina community college, a private in-state institution, or a 4-year out-of-state, either a public or a private school. when they delay enrollment and they enroll within 2 years, they're really very likely to end up at a community college. As you get towards more delayed enrollments, community colleges remain the leading place that students enroll, but we see a very large increase in 4-year out-of-state enrollments. And that table on the right highlights the top 5 institutions that individuals who delayed more than 2 years and enrolled at a 4-year institution enrolled at. And as you can see, the first 3 of those schools are for-profit institutions. So this is one of those concerns. One of the reasons we focus on-time enrollments is it's the easiest indicator to move. But the other reason is that what we see is that when students delay enrollments, they're increasingly likely to enroll at institutions that may be for-profit, that are going to have higher expenses and often poorer outcomes for their students than some of the institutions that are likely to attract students immediately. So that's it that I have for our kind of top findings. Look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
So thanks, Becky. So there is one, we can open up to the phone, but there was one question here from Jeff Cox. I'm not sure if everyone can see it if you're not logged in, but Jeff was asking, do we know in the Hispanic subgroup how many of the students are documented versus undocumented? I would imagine the gap is larger for students who are not documented.
I think that's a great question, Jeff, and one that I don't think we have really good data to know exactly on the student level. What I do know from conversations with Ricky Hurtado at the Scholars Latino Initiative at UNC, just 1 second. Matthew, if you can mute everybody and then unmute me.
Oh yeah, I think we're there. Sorry about that.
Okay, cool. So
didn't mean to mute you that way. Sorry.
That's all right. So one of the things we do know from estimates from is that about half of the estimates would suggest that about half of North Carolina's Hispanic or Latino children live in mixed status households where they themselves are documented and very likely to be citizens and US born, but their parents may not be documented. So that is definitely a known barrier, but I don't know it in this data. I just know it more conceptually.
Just one quick comment to that. Even those students face barriers with enrollment because as they go through the RDS system, they're reluctant to answer questions about their parents' citizenship status. So even though they may be citizens, we've encountered just several anecdotal examples of where the students are reluctant to go through the enrollment process because they don't want to talk about their parents' status.
I think that's a very good point.
Any other questions? Comment? Now's your chance.
Well, you can also reach me if you do have questions or comments that come up. Happy to answer them. I know that this is a lot of data, and just be forewarned, this is a small amount of data compared to the next brief. So definitely we can revisit questions that might arise as we cover more information, because to some extent what we've done here is we've laid the groundwork for themes that we'll revisit in the next 3 memos.